The Washington Post reports that amid the coronavirus crisis, President Trump is growing concerned about its growing impact on his re-election campaign. The paper reports that some of Trump's advisors have described him as glum and shell-shocked by recent polls, which have shown him trailing to Joe Biden. Quote, in private conversations, Trump has struggled to process how his fortunes suddenly changed from believing he was on a glide path to re-election to realizing that he is losing to the likely Democratic nominee in virtually every poll, including his own campaign's internal surveys, advisors told the Post. Trump is also concerned about the possibility that a second wave of the coronavirus this fall could further hurt his chances in November, according to advisors, aides, and other allies. He's not doing very well in these polls, Joe.
Well, and the Washington Post is also reporting, Bob Costa, that a lot of Republican senators are frightened by their prospects, and for good reason.
This would be a good time to speak out then.
Yeah, I mean, thanks to a combination of the shrinking economy, the president's botching of this outbreak every day, and also rising enthusiasm among Democratic voters. The Post notes that in recent weeks, Republican senators have been forced into the difficult position of touting their own response to the pandemic without overtly distancing themselves from the president, who's under scrutiny, but still also has pretty big sway with Republican voters. One Republican strategist closely involved in the Senate races told the Post, quote, it is a bleak picture right now all across the map, to be honest with you. And
wow.
I mean, you look at these races, Bob, Republicans, I mean, if the election were held today, I find it hard to believe that Republicans don't lose Arizona, don't lose Colorado, don't lose Montana, don't lose Maine, don't lose North Carolina. And you have to look at least one of those Georgia seats that they're in danger of losing. Kansas is a real possibility if the past is prologue. This is a Republican Party in deep trouble. They know they're in deep trouble because they look to the White House for guidance, and all they've seen this weekend and since the pandemic began, chaos and mixed signals.
And, Joe, I also picked up some new reporting over the weekend talking to Republican campaign strategists. There is a growing private debate about who should be made the political foil for Republicans. If you're in a tough Senate race, do you run against China in a hardline way? But there's a lot of grumbling among some of these Republicans that the White House is not doing enough to make the case against China. They look at the president's tweets over the weekend and they see the president railing against the media, railing against some Democrats, but they don't see a forceful case day in, day out against China. And there is worry in Republican ranks that because of this pandemic and the economic recession and the possible economic depression on the horizon, they need to find some kind of political target that they all can hit in unison. But there's disagreement among some close to the president because the president still wants to keep this China trade deal afloat. He has had a relationship, as we know, with President Xi Jinping of China. So that's something to watch. How much does the Republican Party turn against China here? How much does the president? Is there a discrepancy in how they go about it?
Well, and Reverend Al, how in the world can you attack China if you're Donald Trump or an ally of Donald Trump when Donald Trump from the beginning has been praising President Xi? In his January 24th tweet, he praised President Xi for his transparency and said, on the behalf of the United States people, I want to thank President Xi for his transparency and how well China's handling this. Everything will work out just fine. Any attack on China is going to be followed by one tweet after another, with Donald Trump saying exactly what he said here. China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus, said Donald Trump. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency, said Donald Trump. It will work out well, said Donald Trump in January, 80,000 deaths ago. In particular, on behalf of the American people, I want to thank President Xi, said Donald Trump, Reverend Al, at a time when the Chinese were not providing White House the White House scientists, people that are working inside the White House and in the administration, the samples they needed to work on a vaccine, and were not providing the White House the data that they were asking. They have not been transparent from the beginning, yet Donald Trump has continued to play nice with China. So how did the Republicans attack China in the fall?
Donald Trump wrote that tweet on January 24th after he was being told that they were being misled about where this pandemic could go. Dr. Fauci said on my show, I became very suspect and felt that this was going wrong mid-January. And I asked him, I said, did you inform the White House and the administration? Yes, mid-January to late January. While he was tweeting this, they were getting contrary information from their own health advisors. And when we look at the fact, Joe, that this president is now in serious political trouble about his reelection, he's not in trouble because of the pandemic. He's in trouble because of how he has mishandled the pandemic. Governor Cuomo in New York and Governor Newsom in California has advanced politically, had many ways have helped their political careers because of how they've handled it. It is the mishandling, it is the inconsistencies, it's the blatant lies that they have told around this pandemic that has put them in trouble, not the pandemic.
Yeah, and you know, Lise, the Rev was talking about how Anthony Fauci was warning the White House in the middle of January. You can go back to early January. The CDC knew about it in early January and were starting to write memos warning HHS. The FDA knew about it. The State Department knew about it. They were writing memos warning the president, warning the White House about it. The Pentagon was worried about it, writing memos warning the White House about it. The intel agencies were warning the president about this in his presidential daily briefings. The Department of HHS finally got to talk to the president in the middle of January, and all he wanted to do was yell at him because flavored vaping had been taken off the market, and he thought that it was hurting him with some of his people. I mean, even Navarro, his trade guy, by the end of January was writing memos to warn the president that up to 500,000 souls, as he said, could perish. But I bring this up because the president didn't do anything in January. He didn't do anything in February. I mean, yes, he had that toothless China ban, but 430,000 people have come in since the beginning of this pandemic from China. 40,000 came in after the toothless ban was put into place. And so the president, it just 1 month moves into another month, moves into another month, and the president's doing nothing but spreading misinformation, telling everybody that everything's going to be okay. As the death toll rises, I mean, the story of the VA clinic, 72 people, vets dead in a VA clinic in New Jersey. The news keeps getting worse, and the president now has resorted to hate tweeting.
Joe, I don't think a victimhood complex on the president's part is going to work quite the same way as it did in 2016. When you have the equivalent of 9/11s happening every day or so, Americans perishing on his watch. And also, you make a good point about just how many warnings Donald Trump had. He also was warned by his own NSC, who battled with Treasury and lost over stopping flights even earlier from China, and the eventual ban was toothless. I just don't, as long as this experiment goes on where Donald Trump is opening up earlier than the American public feels comfortable, you look at a new Monmouth poll that 2-to-1 Americans think that things are opening up too early. Now, I hope that this experiment goes better than planned. I hope that the rate of death declines. Science tells us otherwise. And while I'm rooting for this to be successful, I have a really bad feeling about it. And I don't see how more death and a premature easing and not doing it in a responsible way, because I personally, plenty of things can open up right now, but do it in a responsible way with some federal leadership and just to have some guidelines that make the public, help reassure the public. And that's just not happening right now.
Yeah, to have a White House that's actually sticking to the guidelines.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.